What do you think of Putin's comment in 2017? He said, I have met with 3 US presidents. They all had their own ideas, but the decisions were made by men in dark suits. How much influence or how much decision-making powers does Trump have in all this? And how much credence do you give that comment? Like, it goes back to the whole military-industrial complex. Who is really making the shots?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Very relevant, because during that meeting in the White House, there was a hot mic moment that they caught, and
With
Trump was
Macron.
telling. I don't know who he was talking to be honest, but he was talking to someone, one of the European leaders, I assume.
Yeah.
And he said, I think Putin wants to make a deal with me. He wants to make a deal because it's me. And he said, I think it's crazy, call it crazy, but I really think, I get the sense he wants to make a deal because of me. You know that. One part of it is Trump's ego, right? Trump's ego saying he wants to make a deal with me. I'm the peacemaker. I'm going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, all of that stuff. But there's a lot of honesty in that statement. And I think it rings true from the perspective that if there's any president that Russia and Putin feel they can actually make a deal with and talk to, it's got to be Trump. It wasn't Obama. Obama was never going to make a deal. Biden, no chance. Biden was going to make a deal. So you look at Trump, you look at this guy that likes to make deals, that's willing to talk. And you say, okay, if we can make a deal with anybody, going back to the quote from 2017, yes, it's true, but if there's anybody at this moment in time, this moment in history that we can actually talk to and perhaps get a deal, not only in Ukraine, but maybe a bigger deal that encompasses Europe and also takes our interests into consideration, and also maybe helps the United States on different levels, business level, the Arctic, oil, energy, whatever. I mean, Trump is someone who will actually consider these things. It's got to be this guy. So I think Trump's hot mic moment, that was kind of tongue in cheek, okay, and a little bit of his ego, but I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think Putin understands this, because a lot of people are saying, most people in Russia are saying, we've won this thing. Why now do you want to make a deal? Because you go back to, say, Donetsk and Donbass. Yes, the Ukraine military is being asked to leave, but it's obvious that Russia's going to take these territories sooner or later. They're going to take these territories in a week, in a month, in 3 months. It's going to happen. So, these territories are going to be taken. So isn't it better to get a deal to safeguard Ukraine, to safeguard Europe, for the United States to get something out of it, maybe for the United States to get a lot out of it, rather than to try and fight on in a war that you've lost?
One last question on those men in black suits. It's a tough one, but who do you think he's referring to? What's your interpretation of it? Just the people within the government, the unelected officials. Okay, yeah. Those unelected officials, the permanent state.
Yeah, I think the people that control the Europeans, the people that are calling the shots, say in the Senate. I think that's what you look at. The think tanks, the NGOs, all of these people that we don't know who they are, but these are the people that are influencing policy.
Yeah. The deeper I go into this and trying to understand how governments work and what's happening behind the scenes, the more I realize how complex that machine is. Now, you talked about the current demands by Russia. Ukraine has a pretty fair argument. Like, how can they get guarantees that Russia will not go beyond these 4 oblasts if they agree to the current demands by Russia? What guarantees could Russia offer Ukraine, or at least the West could offer Ukraine? So if it's not troops, not European or US troops, I don't know how sustainable Indian or how trustworthy Indian or Chinese troops would be in that region. Is there anything else that Russia could offer Ukraine in exchange for these territories? Any guarantees?
Good question. Neutrality is the guarantee for Ukraine.
But they did give up those in the Budapest memorandum. They gave up those nuclear weapons.
Well, they didn't really give them up. I mean, my perception of the Budapest memorandum, and I've had extensive conversations with lawyers on this, including Alexander, who's a lawyer. He understands things very well. I've spoken to at length with Robert Barnes, with a lot of lawyers on this issue, and the Budapest Memorandum. That's a set of documents. It's not just one specific memorandum. It is a set of documents, and Ukraine never gave up nuclear weapons. This is a narrative that needs to, I believe, it needs to end. It needs to stop.
Can you explain the narrative to the audience and then tell me how you see it?
Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons.
The narrative is that Ukraine had nuclear weapons and then had to give them up, and that backfired on Ukraine. So that's the narrative. And then what you're saying is that Ukraine never had, exactly.
It never had nuclear weapons. Yeah, it never had. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. Now the Soviet Union dissolved. And Bill Clinton at the time, rightly so, to his credit, Bill Clinton, the United States, the entire world, they had a problem. They had this USSR, this massive, huge Soviet Union, where the nuclear weapons were spread around. Keep in mind that the center was Moscow. So Moscow, long story short, they had the ability to launch those nuclear weapons. They had the launch codes, right? So everything was in Moscow with the Kremlin, with the power structure of the Soviet Union. But the weapons were located in Kazakhstan. They were located in Belarus. They were located in Ukraine. So if you're Bill Clinton and you're coming into this dissolution of the Soviet Union, and you have all of these nuclear weapons, this huge nuclear weapon stockpile, what do? Do you go to Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus and you say, you know what, you guys now are nuclear powers? No. You speak to Russia, which was the inheritor state of the Soviet Union. And people, keep in mind, a lot of people never say this about Russia, but Russia inherited the position of the Soviet Union, which meant, for example, inheriting the Security Council seat at the UN and stuff like that. But you know what else Russia inherited? All of the debt. All of the debt of the Soviet Union. And Russia had to pay all of that off. And they did pay all of that off. It took them a long time, but they paid all of that off, every single cent. So Russia inherited some good things from the Soviet Union by being the successor state. It also inherited a lot of bad things as well. But that was the situation at the time. So Bill Clinton, the United States, they come into the Budapest Memorandum and they say, you know what? Moscow is the center. It has the launch codes. That's where the nuclear, the nuclear, say, nerve center was, the brain was in Moscow. Russia's the successor state. Those weapons have to go to Russia. They're the USSR's weapons, but now they become Russia's weapons. And it just makes sense because instead of having 4 new nuclear powers, you have consistency and you say, they go to Russia. And Kazakhstan and Belarus and Ukraine, you guys are not nuclear powers. They were never your weapons. They were the USSR's weapons. And because Russia's the successor state, those weapons remain with Russia. And it's easier. We deal with Russia now instead of dealing with 4 countries when it comes to nuclear proliferation. Can you imagine the disaster that it would have been if you had a Kazakhstan and a Belarus and a Ukraine overnight becoming nuclear powers? And Moscow delivers the launch codes to all of these countries, which people forget at the time. They had no governments. I mean, it was chaos in the Soviet Union. You didn't know who the government was going to be. You didn't understand who was going to administer the country. I mean, we're looking at this now, 30 years removed. But back then, it was complete chaos. I mean, this was a huge union that was just breaking apart. It was chaotic. You had mafias. There was all kinds of things that was going on. Weapons being sold around all over the world. So, I mean, Bill Clinton made the right call at the time, to his credit. To his credit, he made the right, logical, sane decision.
So kind of linking that to the security guarantees today, though, what does Ukraine have? How can Ukraine deter future Russian aggression? Because obviously we assume Russia invaded Ukraine because of the risks from NATO's expansion and their demands not being met, not being heard. But if that's not the case, if Putin does want more Ukrainian territory, if that changes, if leadership changes in Russia in 10, 20 years' time, how can Ukraine get some sort of security like Finland and Sweden?
Well, Finland, okay, going to the Finland model, Finland after World War II, Finland was on the wrong side of the World War, by the way. But Finland, they made the smart decision of coming to an agreement with Russia, right? They came to an agreement with Russia. They pulled out of the war earlier of World War II, and they decided to come to an understanding with Russia. And they lived in peace with Russia for a good 80 plus years. No issues whatsoever. Actually, Finland was thriving because of the Russian tourism and the Russian business. If you go back to the case of Ukraine, Russia is not and was not seeking territory. Russia is the biggest country in the world. It doesn't need territory. What Russia needs is security. They need to know that NATO is not going to put missiles on their doorstep, on their southern flank, in the south, which can hit Moscow. They need to know that this cannot happen. This can never, ever happen for Russia. And this has been made public for many, many decades. There's no secret that Russia's red line is Ukraine entering NATO. This wasn't something that Putin came up with. This is something that preceded Putin. So this was no secret. But when you go back to the Minsk I and Minsk II agreement, we have to put some perspective to it. The Donbass, with the backing of Russia, but the Donbass militia defeated Ukraine in that conflict. They defeated Ukraine twice. That's why you have Minsk I. That's why you have Minsk II. And people forget that the second time around, when Poroshenko, who was the president at the time, decided to relaunch, he had Minsk I. And Minsk I said Donbass and Lugansk, even though they wanted to enter Russia, what did Putin say? No, you can't enter Russia. You're going to remain in Ukraine. And that gave us Minsk I. What did Poroshenko say? He said, no, I'm going to launch a war. I'm going to relaunch the military campaign against Donbass. And I'm going to call it an anti-terror campaign. So he does that. What happens? About numbers differentiate, but about 10,000 troops, including some NATO forces, some NATO mercenaries, some NATO forces, call them whatever you want, end up being surrounded in an area called the Kosovo. Angela Merkel panics because she realizes these forces are now caught in a cauldron. If these forces get annihilated, the entire Ukraine military collapses. The Poroshenko government, which was the newly installed coup government backed by the collective West, may also collapse. She frantically calls up Putin. She arranges a trip to Moscow, and they agree on Minsk II. What does Minsk II say? Donetsk and Lugansk, no matter how much you want to ascend into Russia to become part of the Russian Federation, we're saying no. You have to remain in Ukraine. Yes, you're going to have some autonomy. For example, the language is protected, the religion will be protected, but you remain a part of Ukraine. That was Minsk I and Minsk II. And Russia had all the opportunity to defeat Ukraine, the Poroshenko government, to defeat the military, to absorb those two regions, and they opted against it because they didn't need the territory. Now, Crimea is a different situation. It's a much different situation. There's a lot more history there. There's a lot more military strategic reasons for Russia and Crimea. But as far as the oblasts in the east of Ukraine, people need to remember that Russia did not want those oblasts during Minsk I or during Minsk II. It just became until